What would you rather have? More inflation, but everybody has a job, or higher unemployment and lower prices? This video discusses the trade-off. Well, first, they show up to a meeting. They present their forecasts for the economy. That's what we're looking at here. For a number of different variables, we have GDP growth, unemployment, PCE inflation. So that's the headline. It's going to include everything. And then core PCE, which takes out the more volatile energy and food. And then their predictions for even their target interest rate, the federal funds rates. And we see for 2023, they project strong growth. There's a bit more uncertainty about 2024, although at least at the time of this recording, nobody is forecasting a recession. The lowest forecast is 0.4% growth. That's real growth after adjusting for inflation. The long run growth rate is going to be somewhere around 2%. And the unemployment rate is forecasted to remain relatively stable. It might go up, it might go down. Again, their long run rate is estimated to be somewhere around 4%. And when do they forecast inflation to return to their 2% target? It might take a little more than just 2024, but we might not see it till 2025. If you're seeing this video in 25 or 26, comment below and tell me how the forecast went. So currently the federal funds rate is 5.5. Next year, we're pretty unsure whether it's going to go up or whether it's going to go down. But by 25 and 26, it's estimated to go down. In the long run, the federal funds rate is looking to be somewhere around 3%. But you see, there's a pretty big band around that. Next, debate the policy choices. What should they do? Should the rate go up or should the rate go down? And then, and this one's important, how do we communicate this to the public? They spend a lot of energy debating what's the best way to communicate it. A slight change in the wording can drastically affect markets. For example, here's a recent statement. The Wall Street Journal puts in track changes, noting how the Fed's statement differed from September 20th, 2023 to November 1st, 2023. It's largely the same statements, but there's a few additions, a few subtractions, but everything's largely the same. For reference, the monetary policy here didn't change. They kept the rate between 5.25% and 5.5%. Some of that wording in the first paragraph is a little more optimistic in the November versus the September statements. First and foremost, their tool that they have to communicate is a formal inflation target. Currently, the United States Federal Reserve targets a 2% inflation per year. So when the inflation rate is above 2%, we know they're going to do efforts to try and bring it down. And we know that if the inflation rate is below 2%, they will do efforts to try to create a little bit. This is one of the best practices adopted by central banks worldwide. They've been doing this for the past 20, 30 years. Gradually, more and more central banks across the world have been adopting this. And this is an effective tool to prevent inflation so that a penny for our thoughts don't become a buck a piece. And we have data showing that countries with formal inflationary targets experience slightly lower inflation. The dotted line is for non-inflation targeted countries, slightly higher than the solid line that have inflation targets. Source below. A question we often have is why not formally target a 0% inflation? Why do we even want 2% inflation? We got a bunch of reasons. Number one, wages are sticky. They don't always go down when the labor market changes. So the labor market supply and demand, they're moving around all the time. That's the volatility of the economy. In order for the labor market to clear, that is, the quantity demanded and the quantity supply of labor to be the same, but if workers are reluctant to accept lower nominal wages, and for very understandable psychological reasons, then it might follow that wages don't fall enough, therefore quantity supply is higher than quantity demanded, we have some unemployment. It's estimated this might be as high as a whole percentage point. Not the end of the world, not a big deal, but still 1% of the labor force is a significant part of the population. So a little bit of inflation, just 1 to 2% a year, helps grease the wheels of the labor market, helping us to maximize employment. Next, nominal interest rates have a floor at 0. You can't bring the nominal interest rate below 0 very well, but a real interest rate could go negative if there's a little bit of inflation. Remember that Fisher formula. Real interest rates are equal to nominal interest rates minus inflation. So if you have 2% inflation, we could bring the real interest rate down even lower, giving us another tool to help fight recessions. There's also a concern that a 0% inflation could risk deflation, which would cause a bit of a recession. Here's what I mean. We don't target inflation perfectly. The Fed doesn't control it. We just try to influence it, but we get close and it can bounce around. If it bounces else is around 2, that's no big deal. Some years it's 1, some years it's 3, no big deal. But if we're targeting 0, some years it might be -1 or even -2. And if you have too much deflation, consumers might pull back. They might think it's better to buy tomorrow rather than buying today. And if consumers stop spending, businesses stop spending, businesses stop hiring, we have more unemployment. It can cause a little bit of a recession, or at least a slowdown in the labor market, which we want to avoid. Finally, the technical measure of CPI and other short-run inflation metrics are found to overstate inflation a little bit. So a 2% target, again, helps us avoid any permanent structural deflationary regime. We are going to build an equation to help the Fed set that interest rate. First, we need to start with some sort of neutral interest rate, and we'll call it the neutral interest rate. This is the interest rate where it doesn't cause inflation or deflation. It's the interest rate we witness when the economy is at maximum employment, when we're at potential GDP, when that output gap is 0. All right, that's all the ways to say it. Next, the Fed targets the nominal interest rate when trying to influence the real interest rate. They can't control inflation directly, but they do control the federal funds rate and the nominal federal funds rate. To get the real federal funds rate, you have to subtract inflation. And then the Fed compares current inflation with the inflationary target. So inflation minus that 2% target. And then finally, we care about full employment, and full employment is closely related to real GDP. How is potential GDP in relation to the actual GDP? If we're in a recession, we better lower those rates. If the economy is overheated, we better raise those rates. Putting all this together, we can get a formal mathematical equation. We call it the Taylor rule, named after this guy named John Taylor. It is the real interest rate, the one that we're targeting, is equal to the neutral interest rate, whatever we estimate that to be, plus 1/2 multiplied by the observed inflation rate minus that target of 2% plus the output gap. So if that output gap is positive, the economy is overheating, we need to raise the rates. If that output gap is negative, we're in a recession, and it's going to be a negative number telling us to lower the interest rate. So let's look at inflation. If the inflation rate is above 2%, it's going to be a positive number. We need to raise the interest rate. But if the inflation rate is below 2%, 0.5 minus 2 is going to be -1.5. That means we're going to lower the interest rate. And this equation helps us balance that dual mandate. How do we use this equation in the real world? This is a graph going back to 1985. In the purple, we have the actual federal funds rate, and in the blue, we have a measure of the Taylor rule. And we find, by and large, the Fed follows this mechanical rule pretty close. But I want to point out to something. In 2009, the recession was so bad, that output gap was so negative, that the Taylor rule spat out a number saying that the interest rate, that nominal interest rate for the federal funds, should be -3%. Well, you can't get negative. And notice it wanted negative, or at least close to negative, all the way to around 2014. So for those 5 years, the Fed needed to have an interest rate that was negative, but they couldn't do it. In the purple, you see it's stuck down at 0. Under Janet Yellen in 2016, they started to raise the rates. But then the pandemic hit, and again, they needed negative rates, which we couldn't quite get. The last interesting bit is 2021. Inflation started to rise. Unemployment was better, but some argue it hadn't gotten back to its potential yet. And so we see a pretty big divergence. The Taylor rule said we should have raised rates early, but the Fed didn't. The Fed did eventually raise rates fast, and then today we see that the Taylor rule and the federal funds rate are matching up again. But this gap is important. The Fed in 2021 was very concerned about full employment. Remember the dual mandate: stable prices, maximum employment. They chose to prioritize maximum employment in 2021. They remember deeply the economic suffering that happened in the 10 years prior. While we didn't experience a 1930s Great Depression in the 2010s, we did have a slow economic recovery from the catastrophic financial crisis. So the Fed prioritized making sure Main Street had full jobs. And they did this. The unemployment rate's been at a near 50-year low. However, it did come with the cost of inflation. And while the Fed eventually acted to fight inflation, they waited to do so. Did they make the right choice? Did they make the right balance between them? Economists and researchers will continue to debate this. But part of what informs it is a value choice. Do you believe inflation is more harmful to people, or unemployment is more harmful to people? How do you make that trade-off?